before we even get started, you I mean, you were a huge part of me turning from somebody that, like so many, looked at the big shiny cities and wanted to potentially get out of Northampton and didn't see it for what it was. You were, I would say, the first and most important voice for me understanding just what a rich, truly twisted, wonderful place Northampton is. And that's something that's grown and grown over the years. So firstly, a heartfelt thank you for that.
You're very, very welcome. I mean, that is what I'd hoped to do. It was exactly that. And by extension, yeah, I mean, I'm talking about how, yeah, Northampton is the centre of the universe, which I think I can argue definitively and persuasively on that point. But by extension, anywhere where somebody is the centre of the universe. And if I can get all of this out of Northampton, then surely anybody anywhere could perhaps do a similar thing, could try and reawaken the mythology, the stories, the actual kind of narrative life of a place, you know. So no, well, that's really great, Mo. I'm really, really gratified to hear that.
No, that's brilliant, and that is kind of where I was hoping to start with you, because I know, well, the mythology of Northampton. If we start there, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you first discovered the mythology of Northampton and how it first grabbed you.
Well, I suppose that it would have first grabbed me when I was far too small and weak to resist. I would have been 4 or 5 whenever I first started to understand adult conversation and could at least read a few words. And then it was all about me. It was in the landscape that I was walking around. It was in the conversation of the adults and the other people around. Oh, did you know that's Cromwell House? That's where Oliver Cromwell slept on the night before the Battle of Naseby. And, oh, did you know this about Peter's Church and all of those Saxon grotesques that are arranged so nicely around its eaves? And, oh, yeah, the round church, that was built by Crusaders. And you start to accumulate all of this stuff. And this is, as a child, you don't even think about it.
Yeah.
You just assume that, I guess everywhere's like this. Everywhere is encrusted with history. It wasn't until I probably was starting my professional life when I had to think about this stuff in a deeper way.
Yeah.
And that was when I started doing a bit of research, while being naturally a lazy person. I found that research is fantastic. Once you drill down into a subject, you find all of this incredible information, incredible poetry that you can mine. I remember reading somewhere in somebody's book they'd got a little afterword that was talking about them, the author of the book, talking to a friend of theirs who was dying of cancer. And partway through the conversation, he was talking about the energy in these little forgotten towns and places. And he was saying, that's why Alan Moore stays where he does. That's why he stays in Northampton. Yes, he's eccentric, but he's not mad. I would debate the terminology there a little bit. I didn't even think I was particularly eccentric. But he was saying, no, he knows what it is. He's sitting on this huge battery of energy, and he's turning it into fiction, which is, that's a pretty fair summary of what I do. And so the aura of Northampton, and it still continues to surprise me. I mean, it wasn't until I was at the end of Jerusalem
Yeah.
Or at least 2/3 of the way through, when I suddenly, I mean, and I hadn't even been entirely sure why I'd called it Jerusalem. I knew it was something to do with William Blake's hymn,
Yeah.
and I managed to find other connections that I'd embedded into the book. But it wasn't until 2/3 of the way through that I found out about the mill at the junction of Tanner Street and Gas Street.
Yeah.
That was, I think, dated from the 13th century, something like that, when it had been called the Marvellous Mill or Marvel's Mill.
Yeah.
And then it had been grabbed by the church because they said, hey, look, we're the church and we own all the mills, so we're having this one as well. And then Henry VIII turned up a couple of hundred years later and sort of said, yeah, I don't really much care for the church. I'm going to give the mills back to the town. And then in the 1700s, in the 18th century, you got a bunch of businessmen led by, I think, Dr. Johnson,
Right.
who, that's purely coincidental and isn't really an interesting part of the story, but it just supports my personal theory that all of this is to do with language, you know. But anyway, this bunch of businessmen, they said, right, we want to buy this corn mill, which was driven by a water wheel.
Yeah.
You can still see the remnants of the mill's race, which is the channel of water. If you go under the bridge, amongst all of the beer cans and disemboweled handbags that you're likely to find under a Northampton bridge,
Yeah.
you know. But you can see the original stonework, and this was powering the mill when it was a corn mill. But when this consortium of businessmen bought it up, they immediately converted it to a cotton mill.
Right.
And there was a cotton mill in Birmingham that was powered, but that was powered by donkeys. So that mill, the remnants of which are under this sort of traffic bridge down there, sort of towards Far Cotton,
Yeah.
that mill was the first powered mill in the world. So the whole industrial age starts there. And as you'd expect, all of the cottage industries around there immediately collapsed,
Yeah.
because that's what industry does. And then a little while after that, you've got Adam Smith, who is the purple gentleman that used to be on the £20 notes.
Yes.
The economist Adam Smith. He either visited the mill or heard about it. And he was very taken with these 3 cotton looms that were all working as if by magic,
Yeah.
with no one to actually control their intricate motions, just a few children employed to sweep out the corners or to unpick one of the machines if it had got tangled up. And Adam Smith looked at this and he thought, wow, this is amazing. It's like there's a hidden hand controlling everything. I mean, this was basically just Adam Smith's poor understanding of simple engineering. But
Yeah.
he thought that would make a really, really good central metaphor for free market economics. And so this is where we get the idea that, yeah, you don't have to regulate the banks or the financial institutions because there's a hidden hand. So, which is basically a mystical idea.
Yeah.
But is the idea which has got us into this hellish mess that we're all in at the moment.
Yeah.
That is why we're living in a bankrupted town, and have been since 2018. It's barely even a town anymore, is it?
Yeah.
It's sort
Yeah.
of, but that all goes back to, yeah, Adam Smith. So under that bridge in Northampton, you've got the origination of capitalism and of free market economics. It's like, originally when I started out talking about Northampton, I thought, yeah, I'm probably overamping this, and I'm overselling it. But sort of, but yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and state that yes, Northampton is the centre of the universe, and all ideas in the human world have their origin in Northampton.
Yeah.
This was before I realised that, yes, we had the first dark satanic mill that William Blake was getting so upset about in that hymn.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, it was a
So-
perfect end to the novel,
Yeah.
and it told me something about the centrality and the importance of Northampton, and I'm still learning to this day. I'll still come up with a story I'll read somewhere and realise just how strange and wonderful this place is. We settled the War of the Roses with magic, as far as I understand it. That at least was the rumour amongst many people, including Richard III. The War of the Roses was concluded here in the Battle of the Cow Meadow.
Yeah.
And I think it was the victor was, I think, Edward IV, I believe. And he was up in Northampton celebrating his victory. I think we'd captured Henry VI
Right.
at the Battle of the Cow Meadow, because we're quite good at capturing kings in Northampton. I think we've got two, sort of, and so yeah, Charles III really better watch it.
Yeah.
Sort of, but
That's the plot. I'm happy to start with you, Alan.
but the Edward IV, he was up here and sort of I think he'd taken a ride through a part of one of the many forests that we have around here, which in its day, that part was known as the Witchwood.
Right, yes.
Might have tipped him off, but no, Edward IV, he carried on riding, and he met this beautiful woman who was sitting in a glade as if waiting for him. And her name was Elizabeth Woodville. And she was there. How she knew he would be riding through that glade at exactly that time of the morning is open to conjecture. But sort of, she was there to put the case for her father and brother, who'd been on the other side in the War of the Roses, and she was asking for clemency for them.
Yeah.
However, apparently King Edward was so taken by her that he married her a few days later in a secret ceremony upon the last night of April.
Right.
Which is May Day Eve.
Yeah.
Which is, I believe, Walpurgis Night, which is one of the 4 witches' special ceremony dates.
Right.
So now, all right, sort of that may have been a coincidence, but you can see how people would talk. And so the narrative became that, after losing the War of the Roses, a Northampton family bewitched the king. And actually, I think Elizabeth Woodville's mother had previously stood trial for witchcraft and poisoning.
Wow.
So it was in the family's reputation. And later Richard III said that the reign of Edward IV should probably be annulled because it had all been sort of engineered and manipulated by Northampton witches.
Wow.
There's a lot of reasons to be proud of this town.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's it's one of the things that gets me about specifically the work that you do around Northampton that I've dipped into is that you give a voice to that spoken tradition almost. You give a voice to the forgotten working class, or you try and find those stories which are trying to be ignored or put down or forgotten about, such as the ones you've already talked about. Was that conscious, or did it just... Yeah,
it's very conscious, because when I started to work on, I think Voice of the Fire. I became, and particularly with Jerusalem, I became very aware that I think my wife Melinda Gebby, she described Jerusalem as a genetic mythology, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty good
Yeah.
because it's only the ruling class who are allowed genetic mythologies, isn't it?
Mm.
And the lives of working people, particularly working people, are not really seen as being lives at all.
Yeah.
They're seen as having no import to the historical narrative, except perhaps as cannon fodder
Mm.
or as sort of window dressing in Dickensian street scenes or sort of things like that. It's a very, very patronising attitude to the class of people who have largely built or been responsible for actually manifesting this society, this culture.
Yeah.
And I was aware of how many. I mean, when you were talking earlier about when did I first become aware of Northampton
Yeah.
legend, this was as often as not in anecdotes, often about members of my own family. You know, the sort of, oh yeah, Ginger Vernon, he was mad.
Yeah.
He would just run up walls and sort of perch on a rooftop looking at chimney pots and haranguing the crowds below. And I think my daughter actually dug up a clipping from an ancient Chronicle and Echo where he'd been taken to court or just that, for standing on a rooftop shouting at people. And there'd be stories about local characters. You'd hear the name Black Charlie
Right.
as somebody in the past in that neighbourhood. It wasn't until I started work on Jerusalem that I realised that this was, I think, Henry George, who was called Black Charlie. He
Right.
was a slave, a former slave from Tennessee, who arrived in the boroughs of Northampton in around about 1897, which would make him one of, not the first, but one of the earliest sort of black residents of the town.
Yeah.
I believe he'd come here on a sheep drive from Wales after coming to England on a cargo ship. Um, he was well known around the neighbourhood and respected. He had a brand on one arm, which this was the first time that I'd actually realised, oh God, they branded slaves. I hadn't actually realised that before.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then I had to work out, when would they have branded him? Because the Civil War was over
Yeah.
in 1865, and I worked out his age. He would have been 13 then. So they'd have branded him before then, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And you have to start wondering, what is the right age to brand a small child? You know, you find yourself thinking some very funny things when you're writing a book. But so that's a mythology right there.
Mm.
This is somebody who lived just up Scarlet Wells Street, but is part of that area's mythology.
Yeah.
You know, Malone the rat catcher, who had pockets full of ferrets and who had two little terriers, and who, for the price of a pint in the pub at Sunday lunchtimes, would actually catch and kill a rat with his teeth. You know, these are perhaps not the most sort of pleasant of mythologies, but then an awful lot of mythology is about some pretty dark things.
Yeah.
You know, it became part of the neighbourhood. It was all of these little lives. Well, they're not little lives. They're the same size as anybody's life.
Yeah.
They're just sort of they're reduced, you know, in the way that they're seen, because
Yeah.
they're always seen through a social lens of kind of, you know, class prejudice.
Yeah.
I wanted to actually show the lives of working people as glorious and mythological things, because everybody's life is a glorious and mythological thing potentially. It's sort of a lot of working class narratives. I appreciate why they're done, and sort of, and they're very, very good, and they make their points. However, there is often a kind of a bleak and bleached out approach to working
Yeah.
class life, probably to make a social point. Oh, look, these people, they have nothing. They even have kind of bleached out looking camera work. You know, it's sort of, but I think that, yes, that's necessary to point out these social injustices and
Mm.
inequality. But I think it's also necessary to give people a luxurious mythology
Yeah.
of their own, to give working people, and that's what I was attempting in Jerusalem,
Yeah.
to give a sort of a sumptuous mythology to people without a pot to piss in, as I think I said on the back cover. You know, that was
Yeah.
the intent, you know.
And I think, well, a couple of things that came to mind there. The first is when you were talking about the mythology of your neighborhood, it was reminding me of the characters that we heard of and met when I was growing up in Dustin. And I think this is the thing, that it's each individual place.
Of course.
Yeah, I remember a story of the general who was a dog for the Melbourne Arms, who apparently took himself to town once on the bus, and things like that. Just these little vignette
These
stories.
marvelous stories, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, like, my very, very dear friend Dominic Allard,
yeah,
the poet,
yes,
who I went to school with, and I remember Dominic's dad. He was a wood merchant, amongst other things, and so he'd go out on his cart with his horse, sort of early in the day, and would gather up what he could. And around lunchtime, I think that he would probably retire to the Marehold, or Merald, as we pronounced it back then.
yeah,
And he would park up the horse and cart. He would go into one of the several pubs on the Marehold, probably the Jolly Smokers. They were all haunted by monks, as I remember.
okay,
Every pub had got a ghostly monk somewhere in its cellar, you know. But Jim Allard would he would refresh himself at the establishment. Then he would come out. He would climb onto his cart, where he would pass out unconscious. Luckily, the horse could remember the route home well enough, so it would trot off down Mayfair. Of course, when it reached the traffic lights at the bottom, it would be a bit of a problem because horses don't understand traffic lights. So it would just do a right turn. It would go down Horse Market, do a right turn into Mayfair, and would trot along there. And then when it got to the top of Free School Street, it would turn down Free School Street, trot down to the Allard's house in their yard, go into the yard where it would stop. Eventually, Jim would wake up and go into the house at the end of his day. You know, I mean, that stuff doesn't happen.
no,
It's sort of, and the story that I read in there's a great book upon the boroughs that was done by, I think, the Northampton Arts, um, an organisation to do with Northampton Arts that existed
yeah,
back in the 80s. But there was a story in that about a woman who was standing on the doorstep of her house in Grafton Street, and a younger woman ran past carrying a baby, gave it to this woman on the doorstep and said, "I can't look after it," and just ran on.
yeah,
And the woman took the baby in, and her husband raised it, and I think it grew up to fight and receive medals in the First World War or the Second. I'm not sure which World
Yeah.
War, but just that thing, that incredibly human action, that incredibly human response, that it seemed to me when I was growing up that the generations before me had possibly been giants in some sense,
Yeah.
whether morally or sort of just as humans, that they had been perhaps bigger people than some of the people that came after them.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just you start to get a sense of the emotional depth of a neighbourhood and the
Yeah.
moral depth and things like that. You know, yeah, those little stories, they're fantastic.
They really are, and I think it's well, certainly one of the things that we try to do in the Happy Hood is find those marginalized voices, those marginalized stories, to share them with the wider community, to let people know that these stories are still happening.
Yeah.
And I wondered if, well, it'd be interesting. Obviously, you said since 2018 we've been bankrupted. I don't think any sober person could disagree with you there. But I mean, there's the old adage that when times are worse, the art gets better. And I'm not sure how true that is or not. But I do know full well that we have these really independent, brilliant voices that spring up from Northampton time and time again. And I was wondering, from your point of view, living in and absorbing the modern Northampton, what is it that you see or feel?
I haven't probably seen the modern Northampton in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
In that, with lockdown,
Yeah.
and I am probably becoming a little less mobile, or perhaps a lot less mobile.
Yeah.
And but I mean, I still hear about the town, and yes, there are still centres of energy and activity, places like the Labour Club, the Lab, you
Yeah.
know, sort of
Absolutely.
where there's places all over the town where people are organising what I was reading a book a little while ago that was talking about the necessity of degrowth in
Mm.
economics.
Yeah.
How we can't just carry on pinning everything upon growth, which is based upon the idea that all the resources are infinite,
Mm.
which they're not, you
No.
know. But in this book, it was talking about ways that we could change things and change the way that we act with the world. And it was talking about the concept of nowtopias, um, which I'm not so sure about the word, but I like the concept. The idea that if we're going to get out of this mess that we're currently in, it will depend upon people organising um, different alternatives in all sorts of areas. That can be in the arts, it can be in supplying food to people, it can be in
Mm.
everything. That if we can get together and perhaps just for a little while demonstrate that people can organise these things, that we don't necessarily need the. I mean, you have to ask yourself where at least the kind of government that we've had has got us. This is an appalling situation, and I don't think
Mm.
there's anybody who could disagree with me.
No.
And so I don't think that the answer to our problems is going to come from the top down.
No.
I think that the answer to our problems is going to have to come from the bottom up because
Mm-hmm.
we are the only people who have the incentive to sort things out. So that's why it's particularly heartening that yes, Northampton has been punched and pulverised. but the spirit of Northampton people is still manifesting in all of these wonderful things like the Happy Hood itself, and dozens of similar incentives. And this is the way that we will do it. If we do it at all, this is how we'll do it. By coming together as people and organising things that make our lives better, and showing that we can do that without the need for authority, without the need for the interventions by people who, for the most part, do not seem to be capable of doing the only jobs that they have. I have said before, and will probably say again because it's a good line, that I think probably the 8 most dangerous words in the English language potentially are competence and proficiency tests for leadership. Why not? If the thing is, I've asked that question before, and I'm never going to receive an answer, am I?
No.
Because if they even admit that they've heard the question, they're doomed. Yeah, this is where this is where the energy, the impetus that will hopefully save us will come from. It will come from the streets. It will come from ordinary people, and who are just putting their energy into something positive and trying to alleviate some of the worst effects of this situation that we've been dumped in.
Yeah, I think you said if we do somewhere in there, and I think that's the thing that I waver from both sides, where I think the positivity that I felt of the community drawing together at the early stages of the pandemic was palpable, and I really felt that.
Yeah.
But the apathy that I feel on a daily basis on the wider scale is what scares me most, I think.
I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think all of us feel the same thing. I would point out that optimism is the only potentially useful approach to this, because pessimism, while it's understandable, that's not going to help, is it?
No.
We have to imagine a future.
Yeah.
We have to be able to imagine a future. I think a lot of our problems come down to a failure of the imagination. That, I mean, when I was in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when I was a younger man, I remember that the big thing hanging over the world then, since I was born in the 50s, but the big thing hanging over the world then was the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that sort of actually this has left us at a terrible impasse, because, and the same thing would apply to, say, the environmental situation.
Yeah.
That it divides the world into roughly 2 sorts of people. There are those people who say, well, the future, it's going to be pretty much the same as today, but perhaps with smaller radios. So we don't need to prepare for the future because it's going to be pretty much the same as today. And the other side say, you fools, there is no future. This will be a radioactive wasteland sort of by the time you're in your 30s or whatever. And they don't have to prepare for a future either, because there's not going to be one.
Yeah.
So nobody is actually prepared to think behind this atomic exclamation mark that's supposedly at the end of human history.
Yeah.
You have to be able to imagine a better world, or you're never going to have one. So, yeah, I mean, that's the other purpose of my work, hopefully, to exercise people's imaginations a bit, to try and get them to think 6 impossible things before breakfast. As the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland said, yeah, it's sort of because I think that imagination is still our best tool.
Yeah.
And it's also one that anybody can afford. You know, it's sort of it's what it's how I got from a childhood down at the bottom of Scarlet Wells Street and Spring Lane in the 50s. It's how I got from there to here.
Yeah.
By employing my imagination. And imagination, it's not just something that you're born with. It's not some supernatural gift of the gods. I remember there's a really good album by a guy called Peter Blakebad, who's a musician and a cartoonist and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But he did an album called King Strut. And on the title track, which is the story of a charismatic character who's risen from a very impoverished background. And there's a beautiful line that says, imagination, like a muscle, will increase with exercise. King Strut developed his by having dreams and telling lies. And I think that there is something in that. It is a muscle. And if you don't use it, if you just sit there and let yourself be passively entertained, then that muscle will atrophy. And you won't be able to think very far. You won't be able to imagine very far. Whereas flex it a bit, do a couple of press ups in your imagination, you know, sort of try and develop those muscles a bit. So yeah.
I think what's really interesting there, what I was thinking was that I think you're a very good example, and you mentioned it at the very top of us talking, that when you have the imagination and you start to put it out into the world and it gains any sort of traction, suddenly that's when you get people trying to kind of, well, batter you in a bit by calling you eccentric or a mad person, or this person's thinking differently to others. This is somebody you shouldn't be listening to. And that's kind of the battle that we're constantly fighting, I think.
You're going to get a resistance that sort of, if you say things that the bulk of your audience perhaps don't want to hear, then, at least in my experience, I mean, if you say outrageous things like perhaps comic companies shouldn't be allowed to steal intellectual property rights from people. I mean, I know that's a contentious and crazy point of view, but if you say things like that, then to an audience, if you start talking about how the great American creator Jack Kirby created probably every Marvel Comics superhero that you've ever seen. No, it wasn't Stan Lee. He just put his name on the writing credit. But sort of, it's probably people aren't going to want to consider that Jack Kirby is probably the biggest single theft from a single human being in human history. When you think that Marvel Entertainment have made, I think, probably upwards of 50 billion from all of those films and rising. And that was all Jack Kirby's intellectual properties. But I've found that when you say things like that to a load of people who are probably queuing up for the next Avengers movie, that they're not really going to want to pay that too much attention. And so people who say these things will probably end up being marginalized. In my own case, I'm still largely typified as a crazy angry guy who wakes up in the morning, he's angry with his pillow, he's angry with his shreddies when he has breakfast, so everything angers him. So if he says he's angered about this or that, it doesn't really matter because he's just angry. There's no real point to his anger. So it's a way of diffusing questions that people would rather not answer, would rather not hear, you know. But you know, you can get around.
What I love about that is the optimist in me. I can't help but think of how you saying that back then and being completely the angry guy on the hill potentially led directly to creator-owned comics, although it took a good 30 years from you having your intellectual property stolen. And that's, although like I'm thinking of Image Comics specifically and their mantra of you come to us, you own the property and it's yours to do with what you will. We won't get involved. We know you're the creator and we want you to create. I guess that's where I see the optimism of it all.
So, and personally, I can, you're absolutely right. Personally, that all happened a bit late for me.
Yes, absolutely.
It's sort of, I mean, and like I'm completely out of the industry now.
Yeah,
it's sort of, and very glad to be so. It's sort of, I really, at the moment, I don't really want to be associated with comics. You know, because it's such a trail of tears, and I don't want to be a perpetually angry guy, which I probably would be if I thought about comics too much. I mean, like, I did manage to satisfy a lot of my inner turmoil about the comics industry with a story in the collection of short stories that came out recently, Illuminations.
Yes.
There's a story in there. It's pretending to be a short story. It's actually novel length, but sort of it's a story called What We Can Know About Thunderman. And I wrote that in about 3 months, the year before last. This novel length thing, it just came pouring out. And that was how I feel about the comics industry from lots of different angles. And I think carefully considered and quite funny in places, and horrifically sickening in other places. And sometimes at the same time, you know. But with that has at least stopped me from muttering in the bath in the mornings.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a benefit right there. You know? Yeah. This is a constant thing. And at the moment, where people do seem to be so vociferous, and of course they have anybody who's got an internet connection. I mean, this is at the moment, I think, the major criterion for being a critic of any kind. I mean, it used to be that you had to be schooled and skilled in that particular. Pauline Kael, the film critic, she was brilliant. You know, these days, if you've got an internet connection, that is your qualification.
Yeah.
No, it's sort of so. Yeah, the state of cultural criticism and the flux of it. It's sort of. This is one of the reasons why I stay away from the internet. That I live outside the. Well, I figured that when this all started coming up, I thought, well, if there's going to be this huge social experiment that will be conducted whether we like it or not, it might be good to have at least somebody outside the petri dish, you know, which I have not regretted. You know, I realise that a huge chunk of modern life and culture passes me by, but I get by all right with the little trickle of information that I do glean from places.
That's amazing. I just have two really quick kind of questions to finish up on, if that's all right. The first one actually came to me whilst you were talking about the novel-length short story that you wrote about the comic book industry and put everything into there. Would you say that your writing has been, in general, therapy throughout your life? Is it something where it always comes, or is it a mix depending on what it is that grabs your interest at the time?
I think that the Thunderman story is probably one of the few. Yeah, all of your stories are based upon something in your life or something that's gone through your head at some point, some thought that you've had. And you, of course, when you're writing characters, you infuse those characters with your own personality.
Yeah.
But I think that although all of my stories are personal in that sense, I would think that Thunderman is the only one where I can remember where I've definitely addressed something for possibly therapeutic purposes.
Right.
What you was, most of the others are just thought experiments. There's a lot of play involved. I'll come up with a stupid idea, and then think, well, how could I possibly extend this idea and make it even more stupid?
Yeah.
You know, another story in that collection. There's the improbably complex high energy state, which is one where I'd heard about entropy and thought, okay, so the universe ends in freezing, dark disorganization. So doesn't that imply that it must have started in an improbably complex high energy state? So once I'd thought of that, and I'd thought of, well, what could have existed then? And I thought about the theoretical physics, Ludwig Boltzmann, who came up with the idea of a hypothetical entity called a Boltzmann brain that would just be when particles congeal by accident and accidentally form a sentient brain, which, that sometimes science gets a bit strange, but I like the idea. And so, that was a thought experiment. It was playing, and it enabled me to get a lot of good jokes in. And stuff like that. And generally, it's an intellectual idea. It's something like that sparks most of the stories, although they're all full of my personal observations, or sometimes there'll be characters that will borrow from a personality trait of someone that I've known,
Right.
But they'll be composites. They won't really be, except in Jerusalem, where I was actually talking about specific people, although most of them I was giving assumed names to protect the guilty,
Nice.
I think it's largely just playing with ideas and then seeing where that takes me. But there'll always be whatever's on my mind will probably work its way into the story.
Sure.
I think that Thunderman was the only one which was a kind of personal exorcism of some sort.
Yeah. And I'd imagine just as gory and painful at times.
Well, yes, it's sort of, it's, it's like, it was my personal experiences and things I've heard, so there were other people's miseries in there, and there wasn't a character in Jerusalem who was supposed to be me. I don't very often do that. I did it specifically in Jerusalem, where I was in drag as the Alma Warren character. Because I just thought, this will deflect any egotism and sort of, it will make it, he's talking about his own life. Well, yes, I probably was, but sort of by stepping into a female artist who looks a bit weird rather than being a male writer who looks a bit weird. I thought that that would, you know, enable me to sort of pull it off better. But sort of, yeah, you know, I mean, other than that, I don't really put myself into stories a lot. So,
No.
although, of course, I'm putting everything into all of the story, I'm just not
Of course.
doing it as me. You
Yeah.
know, it's just,
Yeah.
you know, all of your observations of life and people are going to end up somewhere in your
Yeah.
writing. You know,
Yeah.
if it's good writing, if it's
Yes.
heartfelt.
Yeah. Yeah. From the heart.
Yeah.
I just the last question I had to ask. I'm a massive stand-up comedy fan, and I've noticed that stand-up comedians seem drawn to you in recent years, especially. They seem to, and I wondered whether they seek you out or you seek them out, or there's something in between.
Well, I mean, like probably a bit of both. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of. Um, our, my friends that are stand-up comedians are great people,
Yeah.
you know, and it's sort of. I remember a few years ago, Robin Ince
Yeah.
was doing a thing down at the Bloomsbury Theatre,
Yeah.
which was I think it was um, Christmas Carols for Godless Children or
Yes.
something
Yeah.
like that, where he would get a kind of a mixed bunch of scientists
Yeah.
and comedians, and then me. I think as uh, the token mystic,
Yeah.
and but yeah, that was fun. You
Yeah.
know, like I kind of I'd go on and do a 20-minute spot with the proper comedians, but I eventually kind of packed it in, not because I didn't love doing them, but because
Mm.
I started to feel actually the audience are here. They just like being here, don't they? I could say practically anything, and they would probably laugh. And sort of,
Mm.
so I thought I don't want to be, um, I don't want to be entertaining just because I'm famous.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. Yeah.
sort of. So I've stepped back from that. But yeah, comedians, they're great. I mean, it was somebody who said that stand-up comedians are our secret legislators,
Yeah.
which I can see that. You know, people like Stuart Lee, like Josie
Yes.
Long,
Yeah.
Neary, all of these people. You know, sort of they're commenting upon society. They are laughing at things, and hopefully we're laughing along with them. And this does percolate into if you make an idea ridiculous, if you
Hmm.
expose the ridiculous nature of some of our social policies, then that is what will stick.
Yeah.
A good joke sticks in the mind much longer than a party political broadcast.
Yeah.
It's sort of this is the power of art. You
Yeah.
know, whatever art, whether the art of the stand-up comedian or the writer or the painter or the musician, you know, this is the power of art. It's not just something there to entertain people. Art is there because it's our oldest and most useful way of actually modifying the human experience and human society. It's art that actually brings all of these ideas up to the surface so that people can consider them and then perhaps adopt them. It's sort of art is more than just entertainment, and artists are more than just entertainers who should be glad if they've got a job. That's
Mm.
not the way to think of yourself.
No.
You should remember the enormous power of creativity. That it's what raised us from the mud. It's what raised us from our caveman state. Sort of art and its power. You know, never forget that, and never be convinced that you're powerless. You know, while you've got art, you are never defenseless, and you are never without a sharp implement. You know.
And I can't think of a better way to finish out our talk today. I really appreciate your time.
It's been great, Mo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute honor. And yeah, thank you.